There's a certain type of person who seems to exist in two worlds simultaneously. In the physical world, they're fully present, engaged in deep thought, rich conversations, and meaningful work. But in the digital world, they're almost invisible. They don't share their achievements, their relationships, their daily experiences. While everyone else is broadcasting their lives in real time, these individuals choose silence. And here's what's fascinating. They're often the deepest thinkers among us, the philosophers, the creators, the innovators, the people whose minds are constantly processing, analyzing, synthesizing. So why do deep thinkers prefer silence instead of sharing their lives? What is it about the contemplative mind that resists the urge to broadcast? And what can Carl Jung, the pioneering psychologist who literally invented the terms introvert and extrovert, teach us about this preference for privacy? The answer reveals something profound about the nature of thought itself, about how deep thinking requires conditions that social media fundamentally opposes. Carl Jung understood something revolutionary about human psychology. He recognized that people orient their psychic energy in fundamentally different directions. Extroverts direct their energy outward toward people, activities, and external engagement. They think out loud, process through interaction, and gain energy from social stimulation. But introverts, Jung observed, direct their energy inward. They're drawn to the inner world of thoughts, feelings, and ideas. They process internally before expressing externally, and they recharge through solitude rather than socialization. Deep thinkers, almost by definition, tend toward this introverted orientation, not because they dislike people, but because genuine thinking requires turning inward, creating space for ideas to develop, allowing complexity to unfold without external interruption. Social media operates on the exact opposite principle. It demands constant outward projection, immediate expression, rapid-fire sharing. It rewards those who think out loud, who process publicly, who turn their internal experiences into external content instantly. For deep thinkers, this feels fundamentally wrong. Their thinking process requires time, silence, and privacy. They need to sit with an idea, turn it over in their minds, explore its implications, follow tangent after tangent before they're ready to express anything. By the time they've processed an experience deeply enough to share it, the moment has passed. The vacation is over, the insight has evolved into something else, the experience has been integrated into their understanding. So they simply don't post, not because they have nothing to say, but because their relationship with thought operates on a completely different timeline than social media allows. There's also something crucial happening with what Jung called psychic energy conservation. Jung believed that each person has a finite amount of mental and emotional energy available each day. Every interaction, every decision, every creative act requires energy. And deep thinking is incredibly energy-intensive. It requires sustained concentration, mental stamina, and the ability to hold complex ideas in consciousness simultaneously. Deep thinkers understand this instinctively. They know that their mental energy is their most precious resource, and they guard it carefully. Social media is one of the greatest drains on this resource. Crafting posts, monitoring responses, managing your image, engaging with others' content, it all consumes enormous amounts of psychic energy. Energy that could be spent on actual thinking, on solving problems, on creating something meaningful, on understanding something deeply. So deep thinkers make a strategic choice. They conserve their energy for what matters most to them, for the deep work that gives their lives meaning. They'd rather spend 3 hours in focused contemplation than 30 minutes crafting the perfect post. They'd rather have one profound insight than 100 likes. This isn't antisocial behavior, it's intelligent resource allocation. They're protecting their ability to think deeply by refusing to scatter their attention across shallow digital interactions. Jung also understood something about what he called the introvert's rich inner world. Introverts, he observed, develop sophisticated internal landscapes, complex thought patterns, and deep self-awareness, precisely because they spend so much time in their own minds. This inner richness becomes a source of meaning, satisfaction, and creativity that doesn't depend on external validation. Deep thinkers have cultivated this inner world to an extraordinary degree. They've built entire universes inside their heads, filled with ideas, connections, questions, and possibilities. They can spend hours exploring these internal landscapes, following chains of thought, making unexpected connections, discovering insights that emerge only in silence and solitude. For them, this inner world is infinitely more interesting than anything happening on social media. Why would they interrupt a profound thought to check their notifications? Why would they break their concentration to document an experience? Why would they trade the richness of deep contemplation for the superficiality of digital performance? The answer is simple. They wouldn't, because they've discovered something most people miss, that the most meaningful experiences happen internally, in the quiet spaces where thought unfolds naturally, where understanding deepens gradually, where wisdom emerges slowly. There's also a profound relationship between deep thinking and what Jung called consciousness. For Jung, consciousness wasn't just awareness, it was the hard-won ability to observe yourself, to understand your motivations, to recognize your patterns, to see through the illusions that most people accept unconsciously. Deep thinkers are engaged in this process of becoming conscious. They're constantly examining their own thoughts, questioning their assumptions, analyzing their reactions. They're not content with surface-level understanding. They want to know why they think what they think, where their beliefs come from, what unconscious forces might be influencing them. This kind of rigorous self-examination requires privacy. You can't do this work while performing for an audience. You can't question your deepest assumptions while simultaneously managing your public image. You can't confront uncomfortable truths about yourself while worrying about how others perceive you. So deep thinkers choose silence. They create private space where they can be brutally honest with themselves, where they can explore ideas that might seem half-formed or controversial, where they can change their minds without needing to explain or justify. This privacy isn't about hiding. It's about creating the conditions necessary for genuine intellectual growth. Jung also recognized something important about the relationship between introversion and authenticity. He observed that introverts are often deeply authentic because they're less influenced by external opinions and social pressures. They develop an internal compass, a sense of what's true that doesn't depend on consensus or approval. Deep thinkers embody this authenticity. They're not thinking about what's popular or acceptable. They're thinking about what's true, what's real, what actually makes sense. And this kind of thinking often leads to conclusions that don't fit neatly into social media narratives. Deep thinkers understand that truth is often complex, nuanced, and resistant to simplification. The insights they arrive at, through careful contemplation, can't be reduced to a caption or a tweet. They can't be adequately expressed in the formats that social media rewards, so rather than distorting their understanding to fit the medium, they simply choose not to share. They protect the integrity of their thinking by keeping it private, where it can remain complex, tentative, and evolving, without being forced into premature or oversimplified expression. This brings us to another crucial aspect of deep thinking that Jung would recognize: the relationship between solitude and creativity. Jung spent significant periods of his life in deliberate solitude, withdrawing from social obligations to focus on his inner work. During these periods, he made his most profound discoveries about the human psyche. He understood that creativity and insight emerge from the unconscious, and they require quiet, uninterrupted time to surface. Deep thinkers know this from experience. Their best ideas don't come when they're scrolling through feeds or crafting posts. They come during long walks, quiet mornings, late-night contemplation, or moments of complete absorption in a problem. These creative moments require what psychologists call flow states, periods of deep concentration where time seems to disappear and you're completely immersed in what you're doing. Social media is the enemy of flow. Its constant interruptions, notifications, and demands for attention fragment your consciousness, making sustained deep thinking nearly impossible. Deep thinkers have recognized this incompatibility. They've chosen to protect their solitude, to guard their creative time, to preserve the conditions that allow genuine insight to emerge. By refusing to participate in the constant connectivity of social media, they're actually protecting their ability to think originally, to discover genuinely new ideas, to create meaningful work. There's also something significant happening with what Jung called the collective versus the individual. Jung warned that modern society exerts enormous pressure toward conformity, toward thinking like everyone else, toward adopting collective opinions without critical examination. Social media amplifies this pressure exponentially. Trending topics, viral content, echo chambers, they all push people toward collective thinking. You see the same ideas repeated endlessly, the same reactions to events, the same moral certainties. And if you spend enough time immersed in this environment, it becomes incredibly difficult to think independently. Deep thinkers resist this collective pull. They need distance from the crowd to think clearly, to form their own opinions, to arrive at conclusions through their own reasoning rather than social pressure. By choosing silence, they're creating that distance. They're protecting their ability to think as individuals rather than being absorbed into the collective mind. This isn't elitism or superiority, it's intellectual self-preservation. They understand that original thinking requires stepping away from what everyone else is thinking, creating space for different perspectives to emerge. Jung also understood something about the burden of being misunderstood. Deep thinkers often arrive at conclusions that others don't immediately grasp. Their thoughts are the product of extensive reading, complex reasoning, and nuanced understanding that can't be easily communicated in brief social media posts. When they do try to share their ideas online, they're often misunderstood, oversimplified, or attacked by people who haven't done the same depth of thinking. This repeated experience of being misunderstood creates a natural reluctance to share. Why invest energy in trying to communicate complex ideas to an audience that's scanning quickly, reacting emotionally, and looking for simple answers? Deep thinkers learn that most social media environments simply aren't conducive to meaningful intellectual exchange. So they save their thoughts for contexts where real dialogue is possible, where nuance is appreciated, where complexity is welcome. This might be in person, in long-form writing, in academic settings, or in carefully chosen communities. But it's rarely on mainstream social media platforms designed for quick consumption and immediate reaction. There's also a profound relationship between deep thinking and what Jung called the introvert's need for meaning over stimulation. Jung observed that introverts are less interested in quantity of experience and more interested in quality and depth. They'd rather have one meaningful conversation than 10 superficial ones. They'd rather read one profound book than consume hundreds of trivial articles. They'd rather sit with one deep question than skim through countless shallow distractions. Social media is built on stimulation. Novelty, constant change, rapid scrolling. It's a stimulation machine designed to keep you engaged through variety rather than depth. Deep thinkers find this exhausting and unsatisfying. They're not looking for stimulation, they're looking for meaning. They want to understand something thoroughly, not sample everything superficially. So they opt out of the stimulation economy entirely. They choose depth over breadth, understanding over awareness, contemplation over consumption. And this choice manifests as silence on social media. They're not posting because they're busy doing something more meaningful, thinking deeply, reading carefully, creating thoughtfully. Let's also consider what Jung understood about the shadow and projection. Jung discovered that much of what we react to in others is actually a reflection of our own unconscious material. When something triggers a strong reaction in you, it's often because it's touching your own shadow, the parts of yourself you haven't fully acknowledged. Deep thinkers who spend time observing social media without participating often become acutely aware of this dynamic. They notice their own reactions. They see how they project onto others. They recognize when something resonates because it's revealing something about their own psyche. This awareness makes them cautious about participating. They understand that posting would make them targets for others' projections. People would react to their posts based on their own unconscious material, not necessarily based on what was actually said. Deep thinkers don't want to become screens for others' projections. They don't want to spend their energy managing the emotional reactions that social media inevitably triggers. So they maintain their boundaries by remaining silent, by observing without becoming objects of observation themselves. There's also something crucial about the relationship between thinking and language. Jung understood that the deepest insights often exist beyond language, in a realm of symbols, images, and intuitions that resist verbal expression. Deep thinkers frequently encounter this problem. They have profound understanding, they sense connections and patterns, but translating these insights into words feels inadequate, even distorting. Language simplifies what was complex, makes linear what was multidimensional, makes certain what was beautifully ambiguous. Rather than force their understanding into language that diminishes it, many deep thinkers simply choose silence. They hold their insights internally, where they can remain in their full complexity, continuing to develop and deepen over time. Another profound reason deep thinkers prefer silence relates to Jung's understanding of psychological types and cognitive functions. Jung didn't just identify introversion and extroversion. He also mapped out different thinking styles, particularly what he called introverted thinking versus extroverted thinking. Extroverted thinking organizes the external world, creating systems, structures, and frameworks that can be shared and applied publicly. But introverted thinking, the style that dominates many deep thinkers, is focused on internal logic, personal understanding, and private frameworks of meaning. People with dominant introverted thinking aren't trying to convince others or organize external reality. They're trying to understand things for themselves, to create internal coherence, to make sense of the world according to their own standards of logic and truth. This cognitive orientation naturally resists social media. Why would you post your internal framework of understanding when it's designed for your own comprehension, not public consumption? Why would you try to explain your personal logic to people who operate from completely different frameworks? Deep thinkers with this cognitive style understand that their thinking is valuable precisely because it's personal, deep, and uncompromised by the need to make it publicly palatable. So they keep it to themselves, continuing to refine and develop their understanding privately rather than diluting it through public performance. There's also something significant about what Jung called the introvert's relationship with time. Jung observed that introverts experience time differently than extroverts. While extroverts are often oriented toward the present moment, toward what's happening now in the external world, introverts are more comfortable with extended time horizons. They think about the past deeply, reflecting on experiences and extracting meaning from them. They think about the future extensively, considering implications and possibilities. and they need extended present moments, long stretches of uninterrupted time to think without pressure. Social media operates on an entirely different temporal rhythm. It's immediate, urgent, constantly updating. What's relevant now will be irrelevant in hours. The pressure is always toward nowness, toward capturing and sharing the present moment before it passes. Deep thinkers find this temporal compression suffocating. They need time to think, time that extends beyond the urgent now of social media. An experience that happened last month might still be processing in their minds, yielding insights weeks or months later. A question they're pondering might take years to fully explore. This extended relationship with time means that by the time they've fully processed something, it's no longer timely in social media terms, so they simply opt out of the race for immediacy. They think on their own schedule, which is slower, deeper, and more thorough than social media allows. Jung also understood something about what he called psychological differentiation, the process of developing your unique cognitive strengths rather than trying to be balanced in all areas. Deep thinkers have often undergone significant differentiation. They've developed their thinking function to a high degree, sometimes at the expense of other functions like social performance or emotional expression. This differentiation makes them exceptionally good at what they do, thinking deeply, analyzing complex problems, generating original insights. But it also means they may be less skilled at the social performance that social media rewards. Rather than view this as a deficit, Jung would see it as specialization. Deep thinkers have developed their natural strengths, and those strengths simply don't align with social media's demands. They're not failing at social media, they're succeeding at something more important, genuine intellectual development. And they're wise enough to focus their energy where their gifts lie, rather than trying to compensate for areas that don't interest them or serve their purpose. There's also a fascinating connection to what Jung called the transcendent function, the psyche's ability to reconcile opposites and generate new possibilities. Deep thinking often involves holding contradictory ideas simultaneously, tolerating ambiguity, and allowing paradoxes to exist without rushing to resolve them. Jung believed this capacity to hold tension was essential for psychological and intellectual growth. New insights emerge from the tension between opposing ideas, not from choosing one side and rejecting the other. But social media has little tolerance for ambiguity. The format demands clear positions, definitive statements, choosing sides. Nuance gets lost. Complexity gets reduced. Paradoxes get flattened into false dichotomies. Deep thinkers recognize that expressing their actual thinking on social media would require either oversimplifying it to fit the format or being misunderstood by audiences looking for simple clarity. Neither option is acceptable, so they protect their capacity to think in complex, paradoxical ways by keeping their thoughts private, where they can remain appropriately complicated and unresolved. Let's also consider what Jung understood about the relationship between solitude and psychological health. Contrary to popular belief, Jung didn't see introversion or the preference for solitude as problems to be fixed. He saw them as legitimate orientations that served important psychological functions. Solitude, for deep thinkers, isn't loneliness. It's the necessary condition for their best work, for their psychological well-being, for their sense of purpose and meaning. When deep thinkers choose silence on social media, they're choosing solitude over connectivity. And for them, this isn't a sacrifice, it's a preference. They genuinely prefer the company of their own thoughts to the constant chatter of social feeds. They find more satisfaction in 1 hour of deep reading than in a day of scrolling. They feel more alive when they're thinking through a complex problem than when they're checking notifications. This isn't anti-social, it's self-aware. They know what nourishes them, and they've organized their lives accordingly. Social media simply doesn't make the cut. There's also something profound about what Jung called the numinous, experiences of profound meaning that touch something deeper than the everyday ego. Jung believed that human beings need these experiences to feel fully alive, to sense that life has significance beyond material concerns. Deep thinkers often encounter the numinous through their thinking. When a profound insight emerges, when disparate ideas suddenly connect, when understanding deepens in a moment of clarity, there's a sense of touching something larger than yourself. These moments are sacred to deep thinkers. They're the peak experiences that make the hard work of thinking worthwhile. And they're intensely private. The idea of immediately posting about such an experience, of turning it into content, feels like a violation, like commodifying something sacred. So deep thinkers protect these moments by keeping them to themselves, by allowing them to remain personal and numinous rather than public and ordinary. This reverence for the sacred dimension of thinking is part of why they prefer silence. Finally, there's something to be said about wisdom itself. Jung believed that wisdom comes not from accumulating information, but from integrating experience, from achieving depth of understanding rather than breadth of knowledge. Deep thinkers are pursuing wisdom in this classical sense. They're not trying to know everything superficially. They're trying to understand some things profoundly. And wisdom, as Jung understood, develops in silence. It emerges from reflection, from sitting with questions rather than rushing to answers, from allowing understanding to mature slowly over time. Social media is incompatible with this process. It rewards quick reactions, instant opinions, immediate takes on complex issues. It has no patience for the slow cultivation of wisdom. Deep thinkers recognize this incompatibility and make a choice. They choose the long path of genuine wisdom over the short path of appearing informed. They'd rather spend years developing real understanding than minutes crafting clever posts. This choice requires patience, humility, and a long-term orientation that's increasingly rare. But it's precisely this choice that allows them to become genuinely wise rather than merely well-informed. Jung also understood something crucial about what he called psychological independence, the ability to stand alone with your convictions without needing constant external validation. Deep thinkers have typically developed this independence to a remarkable degree. They don't need others to confirm that their thinking is valuable. They can assess the quality of their own ideas internally. They trust their own judgment. They know when they've understood something deeply, when they've thought something through carefully, when they've arrived at a genuine insight. This internal sense of validation makes external validation from social media unnecessary and even unwelcome. Likes and comments can't tell them anything they don't already know about the quality of their thinking. In fact, social media validation might actually distort their self-assessment, making them more concerned with what's popular than what's true. By staying silent, they preserve their psychological independence. They remain the final judge of their own thinking, unswayed by the crowd's approval or disapproval. There's also something profound about the relationship between deep thinking and what Jung called individuation, the lifelong process of becoming your authentic self. Individuation requires differentiating yourself from collective influences, discovering what's uniquely yours rather than what you've absorbed from others. Deep thinkers are often far along in this process. They've separated their thinking from collective thought patterns. They've discovered their own questions, their own methods, their own areas of interest. They're thinking as individuals rather than as members of a group. Social media works against individuation. It creates echo chambers where everyone thinks similarly. It rewards conformity to group beliefs. It makes original thinking visible and thus vulnerable to attack. Deep thinkers understand that maintaining their individuation requires limiting their exposure to collective influences. By choosing silence on social media, they're protecting the distinctiveness of their thinking, ensuring that their ideas remain genuinely their own rather than variations on collective themes. Let's also consider what Jung understood about the role of the unconscious in creative and intellectual work. Jung believed that the most profound insights don't come from conscious effort alone. They emerge from the unconscious, from depths of the psyche that operate beyond awareness. But this unconscious process requires specific conditions. It needs quiet, patience, and the freedom to work without interruption. Deep thinkers know how to create these conditions. They've learned to trust the unconscious process, to pose questions and then wait, allowing their unconscious minds to work on problems in the background. Often their best insights come not while they're actively thinking, but during walks, before sleep, or upon waking, when the boundary between conscious and unconscious is thin. Social media interferes with this process. Its constant stimulation keeps consciousness active and engaged, leaving no space for the unconscious to contribute. Its demand for immediate expression pressures you to articulate ideas before they've fully formed in the depths. Deep thinkers protect their relationship with the unconscious by maintaining silence and solitude, creating the conditions where genuine insight can emerge organically rather than being forced prematurely into consciousness. There's also something significant about what researchers today call the paradox of connection. Studies show that while social media promises to connect us, heavy users often report feeling more isolated, anxious, and disconnected than those who use it minimally or not at all. Deep thinkers seem to have intuited this paradox before the research confirmed it. They understand that real connection requires presence, vulnerability, and depth, qualities that are difficult to achieve through screens and posts. So rather than pursuing the illusion of connection through social media, they invest their social energy in fewer, deeper relationships. They have long conversations with close friends. They engage in intellectual partnerships with fellow thinkers. They participate in communities built around shared interests and values. These connections are genuine, nourishing, and meaningful in ways that social media connections rarely are. Their silence on social media isn't isolation. It's a strategic choice to invest their limited social energy where it will yield genuine connection rather than its digital simulation. Jung also spoke about what he called the second half of life, a period when people naturally turn inward, becoming less concerned with external achievement and more interested in meaning, wisdom, and self-understanding. Many deep thinkers, regardless of their actual age, seem to operate from this second half of life orientation. They're not interested in collecting likes or building followers. They're interested in understanding themselves and the world more deeply. They're asking the big questions that have preoccupied philosophers for millennia. Who am I? What matters? What is true? What gives life meaning? These questions can't be answered on social media. They require sustained contemplation, honest self-examination, and the courage to face uncertainty. Deep thinkers are engaged in this profound work, and social media would only distract from it. Finally, there's something to be said about the deep thinker's relationship with time and legacy. Jung understood that truly original work often isn't appreciated in its own time. The insights that matter most may take decades or even generations to be fully understood. Deep thinkers seem to operate with this longer timeline in mind. They're not thinking for today's audience, they're thinking for the ages, or at least for their future selves. They're developing understanding that will remain relevant long after today's trending topics are forgotten. This orientation toward timeless truth rather than timely relevance naturally leads to silence on social media. Why chase today's conversations when you're interested in ideas that transcend any particular moment? Why perform for an audience that may not be capable of understanding what you're working on? Deep thinkers are content to work in obscurity, to develop their ideas fully before sharing them, if they ever share them at all. They understand that the work itself is the reward, that genuine understanding is its own satisfaction, that thinking deeply is valuable regardless of whether anyone else witnesses or acknowledges it. In the end, deep thinkers prefer silence not because they have nothing to say, but because they have too much to say and know that social media isn't the right medium. They prefer silence because their thinking requires conditions, solitude, time, privacy that social media destroys. They prefer silence because they've discovered that the richest intellectual life happens internally, in the quiet spaces where thoughts can develop without performance pressure, where insights can mature without being prematurely expressed, where wisdom can grow without being commodified. Carl Jung would recognize these individuals as exemplars of psychological health. People who've honored their introverted nature, protected their intellectual integrity, and chosen depth over display. They've understood that in a world obsessed with sharing, the greatest act of wisdom is sometimes choosing silence, not as absence, but as presence, not as withdrawal, but as engagement with what matters most, the life of the mind itself.